There's a war happening inside you right now, and you've been losing it without even knowing you were in it. Not against anyone else. Against yourself. Every time you said you'd start Monday and didn't. Every time you knew the right move and made the comfortable one instead. That wasn't weakness. That was unclaimed territory inside your own mind, still governed by whoever got there first. Fear, habit, someone else's voice from years ago that you never actually agreed with. The people who seem to have the world responding to them, opening doors, handing them opportunity after opportunity, they didn't get lucky. They won a war you haven't even started fighting yet. A private one, fought in silence, with no audience, long before anything on the outside ever changed. The world didn't bend to them because they asked nicely. It bent because there was nothing left inside them still fighting itself. Stay with me for the next few minutes, because you're about to see exactly what territory you've already surrendered without a fight, and the first move that starts taking it back. Let's start with the territory itself, because you can't reclaim ground you've never actually mapped. Most people assume their mind is simply theirs, a private space, fully under their own command, the way a house belongs to whoever lives in it. But a mind isn't like a house you moved into empty. It's more like land that was already inhabited before you were old enough to have a say in it. Every fear you never chose to have, every ceiling on what you thought you deserved, every reflex to shrink instead of speak, none of that was built by you. It was built on you, by forces that got there first. Parents doing their best with what they knew. A culture that rewarded caution over ambition. A single sharp comment at exactly the wrong age that quietly drew a border you've been living inside of ever since. He'll build his entire body of work around a pattern he noticed again and again in the men he studied who had gone on to real, lasting achievement. It wasn't talent that separated them, and it wasn't circumstance either. Almost every one of them could point to a specific turning point. A moment they stopped reacting to their own mind and started directing it instead. He called this self-mastery, and he placed it beneath every other principle he ever wrote about, not as a nice bonus skill, but as the prerequisite. Without it, in his view, every other ambition eventually collapsed back into the same old patterns, because the mind running the operation had never actually been put in charge of itself. Think about what it actually means to be ruled by territory you didn't choose. A man sits across from someone offering him an opportunity that could change his life, a promotion, a partnership, a bigger swing than he's ever taken. And before he's even finished hearing the offer, something in him has already started building the case against it. Not because the opportunity is bad, because some old, occupying voice, installed decades ago by someone who meant well or didn't mean anything by it at all, still holds authority over that part of his mind that he never formally revoked. That voice doesn't announce itself as fear. It sounds like caution. It sounds like being realistic. It sounds, most convincingly of all, like his own voice, because after enough years, an occupying force stops sounding foreign. It sounds like home. You have not been making entirely free decisions your whole life. You've been making decisions filtered through ground you never agreed to hand over, governed by rules written before you were old enough to read them, let alone challenge them. And the cruel trick of it is that occupied territory rarely feels like occupation. It feels like personality. It feels like that's just who I am. You mistake the border for the shape of the land itself. Here's where it gets genuinely interesting, because this isn't a life sentence. Hill's work rests on a premise that would have sounded almost radical for his era and still challenges people today, that the mind isn't fixed property with a permanent owner. It's territory that can change hands. Every single time you catch an old reflexive fear mid-sentence and consciously choose a different response, you're not just having a thought. You're staging a small, quiet coup against whoever's been holding that particular acre of your mind for years. Picture a woman with a real offer sitting in her inbox right now, a chance to leave a job that's been quietly suffocating her for a decade, for something that pays less at first, but finally feels like hers. The job isn't dangerous. Leaving it isn't dangerous. But some old governing voice, installed long before this particular job even existed, convinced her years ago that stability is safety and ambition is arrogance. And that voice has been running unchallenged in that part of her mind since she was young enough not to notice it moving in. The fear she feels reading that offer isn't really about this decision. It's an old occupier defending old ground, using her own voice to do it. This is why so much conventional advice about confidence and success falls flat. It tells you to think bigger, act bolder, believe in yourself, all while the actual structure underneath those thoughts stays completely untouched. You can plant a new flag on the surface, but if the same old authority still controls the ground beneath it, that flag comes down the moment real pressure arrives. This is precisely what separates people who talk about transformation from people who actually live inside one. Not the size of their goals, the territory they've actually reclaimed versus the territory they've simply repainted. So if this land was settled by forces outside your control, the real question becomes this: how does someone actually take it back? Not through a single dramatic uprising, because that's rarely how real conquest works, in a mind or anywhere else. It starts somewhere much smaller and much stranger than most people expect. Here's the strange part almost nobody expects going in. Reclaiming territory doesn't begin with a battle. It begins with a map. You cannot fight an occupying force you haven't actually located. Most people live their entire lives sensing that something inside them is holding them back, without ever pinning down exactly what that something is or where it's actually operating from. They feel the resistance. They rarely name it. And a fear you can't name is a fear you can't fight. It just becomes weather. Something that happens to you, rather than something you can actually stand against. This is where self-mastery genuinely begins, and it's smaller and less dramatic than people expect. It starts with catching a single reaction in real time and asking one honest question about it. Is this actually mine, or did I inherit it from someone who was governing this ground before I ever arrived? Think about the last time you felt a flash of irrational resistance to something that, on paper, should have excited you. A new opportunity, a bigger ask, a version of your life that would objectively be better than the one you're currently living. If you're honest, that resistance rarely comes with an explanation attached. It just arrives, fully formed, dressed up as good judgment. Most people accept that costume without ever checking what's actually wearing it. He'll describe this first stage of self-mastery in terms of thought control, not suppressing emotion, not pretending fear doesn't exist, but developing the ability to observe a reaction instead of being completely run by it. This distinction matters more than it sounds like it should. There's a difference between a thought happening to you and a thought you've actually examined. The first is occupation. The second is the beginning of sovereignty. Picture a man sitting in a meeting, holding an idea he actually believes in, watching the conversation move past the exact moment he could have spoken it out loud. Right before he opens his mouth, something tightens in his chest, and a quieter, safer version of the idea starts forming instead. In the old version of this moment, that smaller idea simply gets said, if anything gets said at all, and he never questions where the shrinking came from. But this time, something different happens. He notices the tightening. He notices the smaller idea trying to substitute itself in. And instead of obeying it automatically, he asks, silently, fast enough that no one else notices the pause, whose voice is this? The question doesn't need a full answer in that instant. It only needs to interrupt the automatic handoff. This is the actual mechanism behind everything Hill described about governing your own mind, translated out of the more formal language he had available and into how the process actually feels from the inside. He wasn't describing some mystical form of willpower. He was describing interruption, inserting a beat of awareness into something that used to run entirely on autopilot, governed by whoever got there first. That beat doesn't feel like much, but it's the exact point where occupied territory starts becoming contested territory, the necessary first stage before it can ever become reclaimed. Here's something that catches people off guard once they start actually doing this. The old reactions don't go quiet just because you've noticed them. If anything, they get louder for a while, the way any occupying force responds to its first real challenge. You'll name the old fear correctly and still feel its full weight in that exact moment. This isn't failure. It's what contested ground feels like while the outcome is still being decided, and the willingness to sit inside that discomfort without complying, once, is the entire mechanism by which occupied ground actually changes hands. No one applauds a pause half a second longer than usual, but repeated enough times, it's everything. This is also where a lot of people quietly give up, right at the moment the process starts working. They expect the resistance to vanish once they've identified it, and when it doesn't, they conclude naming the fear did nothing. But identification was never meant to eliminate the fear on contact. It was meant to strip it of the one thing that made it powerful, its ability to operate without being questioned. And once you can consistently catch that instant, something else becomes possible. Because noticing an old voice is one thing. Replacing it with a new one, durable enough to hold under real pressure, is a different skill entirely, and it's the one almost nobody teaches properly. So let's talk about that replacement, because noticing an old voice and installing a new one are two entirely different projects, and most people who succeed at the first still fail at the second. Here's the mistake almost everyone makes once they've caught the old fear in the act. They try to argue with it, in the exact moment it shows up, reciting reasons why the fear is wrong, why this time is different, why they should just be brave. This rarely works. You're not dealing with a rational opponent. The old voice isn't a debate partner waiting to be convinced. It's a pattern worn into place by repetition, and patterns don't yield to logic delivered under pressure. They yield to a different pattern, built with the same patience the original one was built with. This is where Hill's writing on autosuggestion earns its place, and it's worth taking seriously instead of glossing over as something too simple to matter. He wasn't describing empty repetition of hollow phrases. He was describing deliberate rehearsal, choosing, in calm moments away from pressure, exactly what you want your mind to reach for automatically when pressure eventually arrives. Because by the time pressure hits, it's too late to be deciding anything for the first time. The response has to already be sitting there, waiting, planted long before it's needed. Think about how a soldier trains. Nobody hands a recruit a rifle for the first time in the middle of live combat and expects sound decisions under fire. Training happens in calm, repetitive, almost boring conditions, so that when chaos arrives, the body already knows what to do without thinking it through from scratch. Self-mastery works the same way. You don't build a new response in the moment that requires it. You build it beforehand, in the unremarkable minutes when nothing is testing you yet. Picture someone who freezes the instant a certain kind of conflict starts brewing. A raised voice, a disagreement, any sign someone might be upset with her. For years, her reflex was to shrink, apologize before she'd done anything wrong. Simply noticing this in the moment wasn't enough. The reflex moved too fast to catch. What actually shifted things happened away from any conflict at all. Driving, showering, lying in bed, she began rehearsing a different response, staying steady, saying one sentence calmly, picturing it clearly enough to feel familiar before she'd ever done it once in real life. Weeks later, in an actual disagreement, the old panic started rising the way it always had. And then, almost on its own, the rehearsed response simply arrived first. Not because she thought her way into it, because it had already been built, waiting, and it beat the old pattern to the moment. There's a reason this rehearsal has to be specific, not vague. A general intention like, I want to be more confident, gives the mind nothing concrete to work with. It's fog, the same fog that undermines a wish anywhere else in this process. But picturing one exact scenario, the specific words, the specific feeling in your chest, as you say them steadily instead of shrinking, gives your mind an actual blueprint to reach for later. This is also where old identity starts loosening its grip, sometimes before a person fully notices. Every time the rehearsed response wins instead of the old reflex, it isn't just one moment changing. It's evidence, proof the old occupying voice was never permanent authority, just a habit that finally met something more prepared than itself. If something in this is landing for you right now, if you can already picture the exact moment an old, reflexive fear has been running the show longer than it should have, write the words "I am ready" in the comments below. Not as a slogan, as a signal you're done letting an unexamined voice decide for you, and ready to start building one that actually belongs to you. The people who take this small step are the ones who carry this forward instead of forgetting it by tomorrow. Because there's a deeper layer to this rehearsal we haven't touched yet, one that explains why some people rehearse a new response for months and still watch the old one win, while others see the shift take hold in a fraction of the time. Here's the layer most people miss, and it explains the gap between rehearsal that works and rehearsal that quietly goes nowhere. It isn't repetition alone. It's what's underneath the repetition. Two people can picture the exact same scenario, use the exact same words, practice with the exact same discipline, and get completely different results, because one of them is rehearsing with feeling attached, and the other is just running lines like an actor bored with the script. Think about the difference between mouthing words absent-mindedly and actually meaning them. Your body knows the difference even when your conscious mind doesn't fully register it. A flat, mechanical rehearsal, going through the motions because you were told to, barely registers as instruction. It's static, wearing the costume of practice. But a rehearsal where you actually let yourself feel the steadiness you're picturing, even for a few honest seconds, sends a completely different signal. Not louder, deeper. This is where a distinction in Hill's work is worth taking seriously instead of skipping past. The idea that thought fused with real emotion carries weight that thought alone simply doesn't. Easy to nod along with, just as easy to abandon in practice, because manufacturing genuine feeling on command sounds difficult, maybe even impossible. But here's what actually makes it workable. You don't need to feel calm about a situation you've never survived. You need to locate the calm you already have from somewhere else in your life, and aim it at this new target instead. Think about a moment, any moment, where you actually stayed steady under real pressure. Not perfectly, just steady enough. A hard conversation you didn't run from. A crisis you handled without falling apart, even if your hands were shaking the whole time. That feeling is real. It happened. It's sitting in you right now, whether or not you've thought to use it this way before. Redirecting it toward a new scenario isn't pretending. It's pointing proof you already earned at ground you haven't claimed yet. There's a man worth picturing here, rehearsing a difficult conversation he's been avoiding with his adult son, one built on years of unspoken resentment neither of them has ever named out loud. Rehearsing the words alone changes almost nothing. He's said versions of them in his head 100 times already, and they've never once made it out of his mouth. What finally shifts something is when he stops just rehearsing the sentence and starts rehearsing the feeling underneath it, the specific steadiness he felt years earlier, negotiating through the hardest month of his business, when he had to stay calm while everything around him wasn't. He locates that feeling. He attaches it to the sentence he's been avoiding. And the rehearsal stops being empty words and starts being something closer to a loaded blueprint, charged and ready. This is why some people can practice a new response for months and watch it collapse the instant real pressure arrives, while others see it hold almost immediately. It was never about how many times the words were repeated. It's whether real feeling ever got attached to them at all. A sentence with no feeling behind it is easily overridden by an old pattern that's had years of emotional weight behind it. A sentence carrying real, located feeling becomes something the old pattern actually has to compete with. This also reframes what rehearsal is actually for. It was never about pretending you're someone you're not yet. It's about proving to your own mind, using evidence it already trusts, that steadiness isn't foreign to you. It's simply been aimed somewhere else until now. And once a new response is genuinely built this way, repeated, specific, and charged with real feeling, something else has to happen next, something most people never think to prepare for at all. Because installing new ground is one thing. Defending it, once the old occupier realizes what's happening, is an entirely different fight. So let's talk about that fight, because almost nobody prepares for it. And it's the exact place where progress quietly reverses for people who did everything right up to this point. Here's what tends to happen once a new response actually starts winning. The old pattern doesn't simply concede. It escalates. This isn't a metaphor stretched too far. It's a real, observable pattern in how change actually unfolds. The first few times a new, steadier response beats the old reflex, something almost paradoxical happens. The old fear doesn't get quieter. It gets louder, sharper, more insistent, as if sensing that its grip is finally being tested for the first time in years. Think about what happens to any long-held habit the moment you actually try to break it. A smoker who quits doesn't feel the craving diminish on day 3. It often intensifies, precisely because the old pattern has never had to defend its territory before, and suddenly it does. This isn't proof the new habit is failing. It's proof the old one is finally being challenged seriously enough to notice. The same exact mechanism governs an old fear, an old ceiling, an old ingrained response to conflict or opportunity. It got comfortable running unopposed for years. The first real opposition doesn't get met with a quiet surrender. It gets met with everything the old pattern has left. Persistence, in Hill's writing, was never described as a pleasant, steady climb. It was described as something closer to defending ground under counterattack, expecting resistance to intensify right before it finally breaks, rather than assuming intensified resistance means the wrong path was chosen. Picture a man 3 weeks into deliberately catching an old pattern of postponing every financial decision out of fear of getting it wrong, a habit that's cost him real opportunities over the years, dressed up each time as caution. The first week feels almost easy, energized by the novelty of doing something different. Then, around week 3, something shifts. The old urge to delay doesn't fade. It spikes, showing up around smaller and smaller decisions than before, with more intensity than he remembers it having. He starts to wonder if he's actually gotten worse instead of better. What he's not seeing yet is that the old pattern isn't gaining strength. It's making its last serious attempt to hold ground it can feel slipping away. This is the exact point where most people quietly retreat, misreading intensified resistance as proof of failure instead of what it actually is, the closing argument of an old pattern that knows it's losing. If he stops here, the old voice gets to claim this moment as evidence it was right all along. If he holds, even shakily, even without full confidence, something different happens. The old pattern runs out of new arguments. It's already used everything it had. There's a specific kind of steadiness required here that has nothing to do with feeling brave. You don't need confidence to hold contested ground. You need willingness to stay uncomfortable a little longer than the old pattern expects you to. That's genuinely all it takes at this stage. Not eliminating the discomfort, just refusing to let it make the decision for you one more time than it already has. This is also where the small, repeated act of noticing, the same half-second interruption from earlier, becomes something more than a technique. It becomes proof, collected in real time, that the ground is actually changing hands. Each time the new response holds under pressure instead of the old one winning by default, that's not a small thing happening in isolation. It's a data point the old pattern can no longer argue against, whether it wants to admit that or not. And once ground has been held long enough to stop being contested at all, once it simply becomes yours, without a fight required to keep it, something interesting happens to how the rest of your life responds to you. Not because anything external changed yet, Because something internal finally stopped being divided against itself. Here's where the title of this video finally starts making sense in a way it couldn't have at the beginning. When territory inside you stops being contested, when a response that used to require conscious effort becomes simply how you operate, something shifts in how you show up in rooms you used to shrink in. Not because you're performing confidence, because there's no longer a war draining energy in the background. Energy you didn't even realize was being spent on internal conflict until it was suddenly available for something else. Think about what it actually costs to operate with a divided mind, even when nobody around you can see it. Every decision gets run through an internal negotiation, one faction wanting to move forward, another quietly building the case for staying small. The same two occupying forces from earlier in this video, still fighting over ground neither has fully claimed. That negotiation happens constantly, mostly beneath conscious awareness, and it's exhausting in a way that's hard to name because you've never operated any other way. You assume that background hum of hesitation is just what having a personality feels like. It isn't. It's the sound of unresolved occupation running in the background of everything you do. When that internal division finally quiets down, something people don't expect happens. They don't feel dramatically different. They feel unusually clear. Decisions that used to take days of internal negotiation start taking minutes. Not because the decisions got easier, but because there's no longer a second voice arguing against the first one before it can even finish forming. He'll describe this state as a mind united behind a single purpose, rather than divided against itself. And it's worth being precise about what that actually looks like in practice, because it isn't the absence of doubt. It's the absence of internal warfare. A person can still feel uncertain about an outcome and move forward anyway, decisively, because uncertainty about the world is completely different from being at war with yourself about whether you're even allowed to try. Here's the part that explains the second half of this video's title, and it isn't mystical the way it might sound at first. The world doesn't bend to you because you demanded it to. It responds differently because you stopped broadcasting division. People, opportunities, rooms, they read internal conflict, even when it's never spoken aloud. Hesitation leaks. Uncertainty about your own worth leaks. And people respond to what leaks out of you far more than they respond to the words you actually say. A person who has stopped fighting themselves carries a different kind of presence, whether or not they're even trying to project one. Quieter, in a way that somehow reads as more solid than anything loud ever could. And that particular kind of solidity is what other people unconsciously organize themselves around. Think about the difference between two people making the exact same request. One asks for something while some part of them is still silently negotiating whether they deserve it. The other asks the same thing having already settled that question internally, long before walking into the room. The words might be nearly identical. The effect on the person listening rarely is. This isn't magic. It's the simple, observable fact that certainty is legible, even when it's never explicitly stated, and rooms respond to legible certainty in ways they never respond to performed confidence sitting on top of unresolved internal doubt. If you've stayed with me until this point in the video, it's because you're committed to creating a life of abundance and success. That's why I invite you to subscribe to the channel. Every video here is designed to help you develop the mindset that attracts wealth, prosperity, and new opportunities every single day. Because there's one more thing worth understanding about this shift, and it's the part almost nobody warns you about. What happens to the people around you once you actually stop being at war with yourself? And why that transition isn't always as welcomed by everyone in your life as you might expect it to be. Here's something almost nobody prepares you for, and it deserves honesty instead of the usual inspirational glossing over. Not everyone in your life is going to celebrate the version of you that stops being at war with yourself. This sounds harsh at first, maybe even cynical. It isn't meant that way. It's simply accurate. and understanding it in advance saves you from mistaking a predictable reaction for a sign that something's gone wrong with the transformation itself. Think about how relationships actually work at the level nobody talks about directly. A lot of connection, more than people like to admit, gets built on shared occupation, two people quietly agreeing, without ever saying it out loud, to stay small in the same specific way. Two friends who've spent years agreeing that ambition is exhausting, that reaching for more is somehow naive, that staying where you are is simply being realistic. That agreement isn't malicious. It's often just comfort, worn smooth by repetition, the same way any occupied territory eventually starts to feel like home to whoever's been living there. Now picture what happens when one person in that dynamic actually starts reclaiming ground. She stops agreeing that ambition is exhausting. She starts moving differently, asking for different things, speaking with a steadiness that wasn't there a year ago. On paper, this should be good news for everyone who cares about her. In practice, it sometimes lands differently, because her change isn't neutral information to the people still occupying the same old ground. It's a mirror, whether she intends it as one or not, showing them exactly how much of their own territory is still under old management. This is why some people respond to someone else's growth with something that looks like concern but functions like resistance. Are you sure you're not changing too fast? I liked you better before, when you were more relaxed about things. These reactions rarely come from cruelty. They come from an old, occupying voice in someone else's mind, suddenly confronted with proof that the ground it's been sitting on was never actually permanent, and reacting the only way it knows how, by trying to pull the new territory back down to match the old. Hill wrote about protecting a definite purpose from what he called negative environment, and while the language feels dated, the observation underneath it holds up completely. What's specific to this particular kind of resistance, though, is that it rarely comes from strangers. It comes from people who love you, filtered through their own unclaimed ground, offered as concern because concern is the only language their occupation knows how to speak. A newly reclaimed piece of territory is fragile in its early stages, not because it isn't real, but because it hasn't yet had time to become fully load-bearing. Exposed daily to that particular flavor of well-meaning resistance, it can slowly get negotiated back into contested status, one loving doubt at a time. The distinction worth drawing here isn't between people who support you and people who don't. Almost no one you love thinks of themselves as standing in your way. The distinction is between relationships built on mutual growth and relationships built, without anyone ever naming it directly, on staying the same size together. The first kind survives this transition easily, sometimes even deepens because of it. Your growth doesn't threaten it, because the other person isn't measuring their own worth against your stillness. The second kind gets tested in ways that can feel disorienting if you weren't expecting it, because your movement disturbs an agreement that was never actually spoken, only assumed. And this raises a harder question than most people are willing to sit with honestly, one worth asking yourself directly instead of rushing past. If your own territory keeps expanding and some of the people around you stay exactly where they've always been, what actually happens to those relationships? Not in theory, in your specific life, with your specific people. That question doesn't have a clean, comfortable answer. But avoiding it doesn't make it disappear. It just delays the moment you'll eventually have to face it anyway. So let's sit with that question honestly, because avoiding it would be its own kind of small self-betrayal after everything we've already walked through together. Here's what tends to happen once someone actually faces it instead of dodging it. Not every relationship survives your growth, and pretending otherwise doesn't protect anyone. It just delays a reckoning that was always going to arrive eventually, usually at a worse moment than if you'd faced it early and honestly. But here's the part that surprises people once they actually go through it. The relationships that don't survive weren't as solid as they seemed. They were held together by shared limitation, not by anything that could actually withstand one person changing shape. Think about a woman who spent a decade in a close friendship built almost entirely around complaining about the same unfulfilled dream, a business neither of them ever started, a book neither of them ever wrote, a version of life they both agreed was probably out of reach for people like them. For years, that shared resignation felt like intimacy. It was comfortable. It required nothing from either of them except continued agreement. Then she actually started the business. Nothing dramatic, just steady, unremarkable effort, the kind we've talked about throughout this entire video. And something in the friendship changed almost immediately, before there was even any real success to point to. Her friend didn't celebrate the first small win. She minimized it, found a reason it probably wouldn't last. Not out of malice. Out of an old, occupied part of her own mind that couldn't bear watching someone else prove the shared story wrong. Reclaiming your own territory sometimes exposes exactly how much of a relationship was actually built on you both staying occupied together. That discovery is painful. It's also, in its own difficult way, clarifying. You're not being asked to abandon people. You're being shown, often for the first time, which connections were built on mutual respect for each other's growth, and which ones were quietly depending on you never having any. This part deserves to be said plainly, without softening it into something more comfortable than it actually is. Growth is not free. It sometimes costs relationships that felt permanent, and grieving that loss is not a sign you did something wrong. It's simply what happens when two people's internal territory stops matching, after years of it matching closely enough to feel like sameness. But here's the part that starts to answer the question this video's title has been building toward the whole time. Once you stop needing certain relationships to stay exactly the same in order to feel secure in who you are, something shifts in how the world responds to you more broadly, not just inside your closest relationships. You stop shrinking yourself to match rooms that were built for a smaller version of you. You stop pre-negotiating your own worth downward before anyone's even asked you to. And rooms, opportunities, people, they respond to that shift whether or not a single word about it is ever spoken out loud. Picture someone walking into a room full of people who don't yet know anything about the internal work she's done. She hasn't announced any of it. She isn't performing confidence, isn't trying to prove anything to anyone in that room. She's simply not divided anymore, not negotiating with herself about whether she belongs there. And something about that steadiness changes how people in the room orient toward her, almost immediately, in a way none of them could fully explain if you asked them why. Nobody in that room can see the territory she reclaimed. They can only feel the absence of the old static that used to surround everything she said and did. That absence reads, to everyone around her, as something worth paying attention to. This is the actual mechanism behind the phrase, the world bends to you, stripped of anything mystical. It was never about the world literally rearranging itself around your wishes. It's about the fact that a mind no longer at war with itself produces a completely different signal than a divided one does. And people, whether consciously or not, organize themselves around whoever in the room seems most whole and least at odds with themselves, far more than they organize around whoever happens to be loudest. And once you understand that this is the actual mechanism, not luck, not some external force responding to positive thinking, but simply what happens when a divided system finally becomes a unified one, a much more practical question emerges. How do you actually know, in your own life, whether a piece of territory has been genuinely reclaimed, or whether you're just telling yourself it has while the old occupier quietly waits for the right moment to test you again? Here's how you actually know, and it isn't a feeling. Feelings, this far into the process, are still too easily manufactured by hope alone. What actually proves reclaimed ground is a test you didn't choose, arriving on a day you weren't prepared for it. Real territory reveals itself under exactly the conditions you'd expect an occupier to try retaking it: stress, fatigue, an old trigger showing up at the worst possible moment, with no time to consciously prepare a rehearsed response. This is the part that separates genuine change from a convincing performance of change. Anyone can hold new ground on a calm Tuesday morning, well-rested, with nothing pressing against them. The real question was never whether the new response works under ideal conditions. It's whether it holds when you're exhausted, blindsided, and the old pattern gets exactly the kind of opening it's been waiting for. Think about someone who spent months building a calmer relationship with financial decisions, pausing before reacting, checking impulses that used to run the whole show. Then, on an ordinary Thursday, something goes wrong that has nothing to do with any of it. A family emergency, a sleepless night, and in the middle of all that unrelated exhaustion, an old, unrelated financial impulse resurfaces, dressed in the exact same disguise it always used to wear. This is the actual test, not the calm mornings spent rehearsing. This unplanned, poorly timed moment, arriving with zero warning, asking a single honest question: did the new ground hold, or did exhaustion hand it right back to whoever used to own it? Here's what's worth understanding about this kind of test, because it changes how you should interpret it when it eventually comes. A single slip during a moment like this doesn't mean nothing changed. It means you're human, operating under conditions specifically designed to favor old patterns over new ones. The difference between someone who's genuinely reclaimed territory and someone who hasn't isn't the complete absence of slips under pressure. It's what happens immediately after. The old self, catching a slip, tends to spiral into it. One slip becomes evidence of total failure, which becomes permission to abandon the whole effort. The reclaimed self notices the slip, names it plainly without the theatrics of self-punishment, and simply returns to the new pattern at the very next opportunity, without treating the single moment as a verdict on the entire process. A slip like this is best understood the way a scout would read one bad skirmish in an otherwise successful campaign. Not a sign the whole territory was lost, just information about which specific flank still needs reinforcing. Maybe it's exhaustion specifically. Maybe it's a certain kind of stress, or being caught without enough time to notice the beat of awareness before reacting. That information is useful. It's not a verdict. Treating it as a verdict is exactly how people talk themselves out of territory they'd actually already reclaimed, simply because reclaimed ground was never advertised as permanently unchallengeable, only as genuinely yours to keep defending. There's a specific kind of maturity this requires, one that looks almost unremarkable from the outside, but changes everything about how sustainable this process actually becomes. It's the willingness to fail at holding new ground occasionally, without using that failure as proof the whole project was a lie. Perfectionism, oddly enough, is one of the most reliable ways people abandon real change, not because they can't sustain it, but because they can't tolerate a single imperfect data point inside an otherwise genuine transformation. Consider what actually separates two people after the identical setback on an identical bad day. One decides the slip proves nothing actually changed and quietly stops trying, letting the old occupier reclaim not just that moment, but everything built up until it. The other treats the slip as whether passing through ground that's still, on balance, genuinely theirs, and returns to the new pattern the very next chance they get, without ceremony, without self-punishment, simply picking the thread back up where it was dropped. The setback was identical for both of them. What diverged, completely, was the story each one told themselves about what that setback meant. This is, in the end, what separates people who talk about self-mastery from people who are actually living inside it. Not the absence of old patterns ever resurfacing. The refusal to let one resurfacing undo the ground already won. And once you can hold that distinction clearly, something becomes possible that wasn't available before. The ability to keep expanding territory instead of endlessly refighting the same small plot of land over and over, every time an old pattern manages one more brief comeback. Here's what almost nobody expects once ground has genuinely been held for a while. The war doesn't just end. it changes shape entirely. For as long as you've been reclaiming territory, the goal has been defense. Notice the old pattern. Interrupt it. Rehearse the new response until it holds under pressure. That's necessary work, and it's exactly what this video has walked through so far. But there's a version of this process where someone gets so used to fighting for ground that they never actually ask a different question once the fighting settles down. What do I do with land that's finally, genuinely mine? Think about someone who spends years working themselves out of debt, dollar by dollar, decision by decision, finally clearing the last balance that used to keep them up at night. That achievement is real. It deserves to be felt fully. But some people, once that specific war ends, don't know what to do next except brace for the next threat, scanning for the next bill, the next emergency, the next reason to stay defensive, because defense is the only mode they ever practiced. They cleared the debt. They never actually learned how to build on the ground underneath it. Hill's own thinking pushed further than most people give him credit for on this exact point. He never treated self-control as an end in itself. He treated it as the opening move in a much longer game. Necessary, but incomplete on its own. The thing that had to happen first specifically so something could actually be built on top of it afterward. Picture the difference between a piece of land that's been successfully defended and a piece of land that's actually being used. A defended field, left empty, still requires vigilance. Someone still has to watch the border, still has to stay alert to intrusion. But a field that's been planted, cultivated, put to work, starts producing something of its own. It stops needing the same constant, exhausting attention because it's no longer simply held. It's active. There's a real difference between a mind that has stopped fighting itself and a mind that has actually started building something with the piece it fought for. This is where the question shifts. Once you've genuinely done the work this video has walked through, it's no longer just, can I catch the old fear before it runs the show? It becomes something larger. Now that this fear doesn't own me anymore, what was I actually trying to build the whole time it was in charge? For a lot of people, that question is almost disorienting the first time it arrives, because they've spent so many years organizing their entire identity around the fight itself. Take the fight away, and there's a strange, unfamiliar quiet where the old noise used to be. Some people mistake that quiet for emptiness. It isn't. It's simply room. The first room they've ever had to actually decide what belongs there. Consider a woman who's spent a decade managing crippling anxiety around public speaking, finally reaching a point where she can stand in front of a room without her voice shaking, without the old spiral taking over before she's said a single word. For years, every ounce of her energy around this particular fear went into simply surviving the moment. Once that survival stopped requiring so much effort, something unexpected happened. She had to figure out, almost for the first time, what she actually wanted to say, now that saying anything at all wasn't the whole battle anymore. The fight had been so consuming that the purpose underneath it had never had room to fully form. Self-mastery was never meant to be the final destination, even though it's easy to treat it that way after everything it takes to get there. It's the ground floor. Hill was explicit that a definite purpose has to exist for any of this to matter beyond simple relief, because ground reclaimed and left empty eventually gets tested again, sometimes successfully, by the very pattern you thought you'd already beaten. Purpose is what actually occupies territory permanently, not vigilance alone. Use. So the honest, final question this video has been building toward isn't simply whether you can win the war inside yourself. It's what you actually intend to do with the version of you who finally isn't fighting it anymore. Let's go back to the very beginning of this video, to the war I told you was already happening inside you. You now know exactly what that war was. Territory settled by people who meant well, or didn't mean anything by it at all, governing parts of your mind you never formally agreed to hand over. A voice mistaken for personality. A fear mistaken for realism. Ground occupied so long ago, and so thoroughly, that surrendering it stopped feeling like surrender at all. It just felt like being you. You also know, now, exactly how that ground gets taken back. Not through a single dramatic uprising. Through a half-second of noticing, repeated until noticing becomes reflex. Through a new response, rehearsed away from pressure until it's ready to meet pressure head-on. Through holding contested ground even while the old occupier fights hardest for it, right before it finally runs out of arguments. Through understanding that a slip isn't a verdict, and that the people around you won't all celebrate a war ending that they're still quietly fighting themselves. None of that was ever about becoming someone unrecognizable. It was about becoming undivided. About a mind that finally stopped spending half its strength fighting itself, and started spending all of it on something worth building. Here's what's true now, whether or not it feels true yet this exact moment. Some ground inside you has already changed hands, somewhere in the last hour, just by sitting with all of this closely enough to actually hear it. You may not feel the shift today. You rarely do, this early. But a seed doesn't announce itself either, and something has been planted regardless of whether you can see it working yet. The world was never going to bend to you because you asked it to, or because you wanted it badly enough, or because you said the right words in the mirror enough mornings in a row. It bends, when it bends at all, because a mind at war broadcasts that war in everything it does, and a mind at peace broadcasts something else entirely, something rooms respond to before anyone in them could tell you why. You don't have to perform that peace. You only have to stop fighting long enough to let it be real. Somewhere ahead of you is a version of your life where this isn't a video you watched once and forgot by the weekend. It's simply how you operate, where the old fear still shows up sometimes, because it never fully disappears for anyone, but it no longer gets to decide anything on its own, where you're not defending the same acre over and over, but finally building something on ground that's actually yours to build on. That version of you isn't waiting for a better moment to begin. There was never going to be one. There's only the ground in front of you right now, and the choice, available in this exact instant, to stop letting an old voice make it for you. You already started. The noticing you did tonight, just by listening this closely, was the first move. Everything after this is repetition, patient, unremarkable, and entirely enough. Follow the channel if this one changed something in you tonight. And if you know someone still fighting a war inside themselves they haven't even named yet, this is the video to send them. Let's go back to the very beginning of this video, to the war I told you was already happening inside you. You now know exactly what that war was. Territory settled by people who meant well, or didn't mean anything by it at all, governing parts of your mind you never formally agreed to hand over. A voice mistaken for personality. A fear mistaken for realism. Ground occupied so long ago, and so thoroughly, that surrendering it stopped feeling like surrender at all. It just felt like being you. You also know, now, exactly how that ground gets taken back. Not through a single dramatic uprising. Through a half-second of noticing, repeated until noticing becomes reflex. Through a new response, rehearsed away from pressure until it's ready to meet pressure head-on. Through holding contested ground even while the old occupier fights hardest for it, right before it finally runs out of arguments. Through understanding that a slip isn't a verdict, and that the people around you won't all celebrate a war ending that they're still quietly fighting themselves. None of that was ever about becoming someone unrecognizable. It was about becoming undivided. About a mind that finally stopped spending half its strength fighting itself, and started spending all of it on something worth building. Here's what's true now, whether or not it feels true yet this exact moment. Some ground inside you has already changed hands, somewhere in the last hour, just by sitting with all of this closely enough to actually hear it. You may not feel the shift today. You rarely do, this early. A newly reclaimed border doesn't come with a flag planting ceremony. It just quietly stops being contested, one ordinary moment at a time, long before you consciously notice the fighting has stopped. The world was never going to bend to you because you asked it to, or because you wanted it badly enough, or because you said the right words in the mirror enough mornings in a row. It bends, when it bends at all, because a mind at war broadcasts that war in everything it does, and a mind at peace broadcasts something else entirely, something rooms respond to before anyone in them could tell you why. You don't have to perform that peace. You only have to stop fighting long enough to let it be real. There's a life waiting on the other side of this, not louder or more dramatic than the one you're living now, just finally undivided, where the old fear still shows up sometimes, because it never fully disappears for anyone, but it no longer gets to decide anything on its own, where you're not defending the same acre over and over, but finally building something on ground that's actually yours to build on. That version of you isn't waiting for a better moment to begin. There was never going to be one. There's only the ground in front of you right now, and the choice, available in this exact instant, to stop letting an old voice make it for you. You already started. The noticing you did tonight, just by listening this closely, was the first move. Everything after this is repetition, patient, unremarkable, and entirely enough. Follow the channel if this one changed something in you tonight, and share it with 5 people who are still fighting a war inside themselves they haven't even named yet.